Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. With the House of Commons now gone for the summer, we are getting kind of a bit of a recap and a reevaluation of what's gone on over the last few months. And part of that has been to look at the hybrid sittings that we've been doing. And what's encouraging for me is that we're getting party leaders and whips and house leaders coming together and saying we'd really like things to go back to normal. And that's really gratifying for someone like me because there's a lot of danger in keeping up these hybrid sittings. So hearing that MPs are frustrated with them as much as that everyone else is good to hear. Because hopefully this means a faster return to normal once we get back, whether that's in the fall or whether we need to recall in the summer for something, or whether it's post-election, because that is always a possibility, especially at this point. But we can't just pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, we've tried it. There's not a big appetite to continue, because we're already getting talk about, well, we might need to keep aspects of it for this reason or that reason. There's talk about serious illness, for example, or parental leave. And that's kind of where I start getting a little bit uneasy still, because this is kind of what I was expecting to happen when they agreed to the hybrid sittings in the first place. This is the whole notion about, opening Pandora's box and letting everything out that's inside. You can't put it back in, and this is kind of where we need to kind of focus going forward. A lot of these sound like, good common sense ideas, but there is a bit of a slippery slope aspect to that, and that tends to be around normalizing the ability to not be in Parliament. And yes, there are legitimate sounding excuses. I mean, parental leave is certainly a good one, and it's one where we keep saying that this is going to be a way to get more young women in politics or people with young families and so on. But there is still that danger in there, because it normalizes not being there and not having those same connections. And once one group gets the exception, more will certainly follow. And some of them, yes, are legitimate, but it also opens the door for other less legitimate reasons. And we're going to see that a lot with certain kinds of populist politics going forward. There are whole swaths of parties who like to shake their fist at Ottawa and pretend that what goes on here is divorced from reality, and therefore they want to spend as much time outside of Ottawa as possible. And we get that with regular MPs as well. I mean, there is this inflated sense of what goes on in their constituency is more important than what goes on in Ottawa, which is not really how the job works. Constituency work is actually a really recent invention. It only goes back to about the 1970s. And even then, it wasn't really normalized for another decade or so. And then it just became this all-consuming thing. And this is something that we should really be careful about, because it's really taking away from the job that MPs should be doing in Ottawa. MPs are not supposed to be kind of an ombudsman for people's interactions with the civil service from their ridings. And they most especially should not be immigration caseworkers. And yet these are the kinds of things that MPs have been doing. And I have this particular notion that once it becomes normalized for MPs to spend more and more time outside of Ottawa doing this kind of work, that it becomes more and more not enforced, but expected that this is the kind of thing that MPs should be doing rather than their actual duties around legislation and the estimates and holding government to account and those kinds of things. And if you've got a certain kind of populist bent where what goes on in Ottawa is what you're fighting against, then it becomes easier for that to really take root and create this sense of absence in Ottawa that and almost a sense of pride that you are spending as little time there as possible. And that is a problem. I mean, already our sitting calendar is a fraction of what it used to be because with the availability of transportation the way it has become, MPs now spend pretty much half the year in their ridings and only half of it in Ottawa. And that amount of time is shrinking considerably as well. So we need to kind of push back against that. The other thing that we've really noticed is the way in which this hybrid setup has really increased the toxicity of what goes on. And part of that is because you don't have to look the other person in the eye. Looking into a camera, at a screen, at one another, it's with that basic psychology that if you're not looking a person in the eye, you get the feeling that you can say more radical things than you would otherwise, and you can be nastier than you would be otherwise. And it really hurts the decorum and the ability to have debate when you can't look the other person in the eye. So I think that is something that we also need to really take into account. This was, without a doubt, one of the most toxic sessions of Parliament that I have seen in my 12 or 13 years that I've been on the Hill. And I mean, the last time I can remember anything even slightly this bad was Harper versus Dion in the dying days of 2008. But this was bad. And we need to kind of look at how these hybrid sessions and sittings contributed to that, because it allowed for this kind of ramping up of the dialogue and personalization of some of it to really kind of ramp up and take, kind of let loose. And I think that's really destructive to our ability to work together in Parliament and to get stuff done and to have reasonable debate and so on. And committees are even worse. We had committees that were basically dysfunctional, in part because of filibustering that happened, sometimes on the Liberals' part, because they were trying to push back against something that the Conservatives and the other opposition parties were pushing forward, because this being a hung Parliament, opposition parties held the majority on the different committees. But also the fact that because the way the hybrid setup works, they only had blocks of time where they could get the IT and the interpretation and so on, which doesn't happen in a regular environment. And that allowed for certain filibusters to carry over for months rather than burning themselves out over the course of 48 hours. And that's a problem, and that's partially why it contributed so much to the toxicity of this last session, or at least this session as it is thus far. And so these are things that we really need to think about when the House leaders and the whips start talking about, well, here's some exceptions going forward that we should be considering, because the more we normalize that, the more we bring up the next generation of MPs who come in to being immersed in the ability to do this hybrid stuff going forward, then the easier it gets to normalize the factors that led to this increasing toxicity. And so these are things that we really need to consider. I'm not saying that we should eschew it entirely. There are, like I said, there could be legitimate reasons. There has been the notion that when it comes to calling emergency committee meetings in the summer, it might make more sense to do those over Zoom rather than having the entire committee fly into Ottawa for an hour and then fly home at the end of that. But we need to really be careful with how we limit the ability to do this so that we don't create opportunities for it to grow and expand. So anyway, something we should be thinking about over the summer, and if in the next election, whenever that happens, maybe have this conversation with our MPs in terms of how they expect this to go forward, or what your expectations are of them when it comes to this question, because it is going to keep coming up. It came up for the 5 years previous to the pandemic, and it's going to only be even more so going forward. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.